Chapter 6 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. The House in Hopefield Avenue. The room was of medium size and plainly though comfortably furnished as a man's study or smoking room. In one corner was a small roll-top desk. In another, a table bearing books and papers and a tantalus. Two large, leather-covered armchairs stood one at each side of the grate, in which burned a cheerful fire. In the corner opposite the window was a press or cupboard built into the wall, and in front of this all furniture had been cleared away, leaving a wide, unoccupied space on the floor. Beside the wall, near this space, was a large camera, already set up, and on a table beside it lay a flashlight apparatus and two dark slides, apparently of full plate size. In the room were four persons, and it was the identity of the last of these that had so amazed Cheyne. Standing beside the camera were Price and Lewisham, while no less a personage than Mr. Hubert Parks of Edgecombe Hotel notoriety stood looking on with his back to the fire. But it was not on these that Cheyne's eyes were glued. Reclining in one of the armchairs with her feet on the fender was Susan, the house and parlour maid at Warren Lodge. Cheyne gasped. Here was the explanation of one mystery at all events. He saw now where the gang's knowledge of himself and his surroundings had been obtained. He remembered that he had discussed his visit to Plymouth during dinner, a day or two before the event. Susan had been waiting at table, and Susan had been the channel through which the information had been passed on. And the burglary. He could see Susan's hand in this also. In all probability she had taken full advantage of her opportunities to make a thorough search of the house for Price's letter, and it was doubtless only when it became necessary to deal with the safe that her friends had been called in. Probably also she had been waiting for them, and had admitted them and shown them over the house before submitting to be tied up as a blind to mislead the detectives who would presumably be called in. Cheyne suspected also that Price's visit was timed at a propitious moment, when he himself was available and with a free afternoon to be filled up. No doubt Susan's part in the affair had been vital to its success, but her participation also showed the extraordinary importance which the conspirators attached to the letter. Susan's make-up for the part she was to play, the forging of her references, her installation in the Cheyne household, and her undertaking nearly 2 months of domestic service in order to gain the document, showed a tenacity of purpose which could only have been evoked to attain some urgent end. Evidently, the gang believed that Price's claim on the barony was good, and evidently the others intended to share the spoils. Cheyne watched breathlessly what was going on in the room, and to his delight, he presently found that through the open upper sash he could also hear a good deal of what was said. The camera had been set up to face the cupboard, and Cheyne now saw that a document of some kind was fastened with drawing pins to its door. Price put his head under the cloth and moved the camera back and forwards, evidently focusing it on the document. Lewisham lifted and examined the flashlight apparatus, then stood waiting. Parks stooped and said something in a low tone to Susan, at which she laughed sarcastically. "Do you think 2 will be enough, or should we take 4? Said Price when he had arranged the camera to his satisfaction. 2, I should say," Parks answered. "Even if we lost the tracing, 2 negatives should be an ample record." "I should take 4, Lewisham declared. "After all we've done, what is the extra trouble of developing a couple of negatives? 1 or 2 might be failures." "Syme is right," Price decided. "I shall take 4. Syme? Cheyne thought perplexedly that the man who had run the motor on the Enid had been introduced to him as Lewisham. Syme, was it? Then it occurred to him that probably each one of the 4 had met him under an assumed name, and he listened even more intently in the hope of finding this out. "I wonder if that ass Cheyne put the cops onto us," went on Syme to the company generally. "James talked to him like a father, and he seemed to swallow it all down as sweet as milk. Lordy! But you should have heard old James spouting. He rattled off his patter like a good 'un. Fresh absurdities each time and all that. Didn't you, James?" "He didn't give much trouble," Price replied. "I shouldn't have believed anyone would have given in as soft as he did. I pitched him a yarn about yours truly being heir to the barony of Hull that wouldn't have deceived an oyster, and he sucked it in like a sponge. But it wasn't that worked. It was keeping him without water that did the trick. When I offered him another day to think it over, he collapsed like a pricked bubble." "So would you if you had been in his shoes," Susan declared. "I'd like to see you standing out for anything against your own comfort." "You wouldn't have seen me get into his shoes," Price retorted, fitting a dark slide into the camera. "Now, Syme, if you're ready." Price pressed the bulb, uncovering the lens, and at the same time Syme burned a length of magnesium wire before the document on the door, while Cheyne writhed with impotent rage at the discovery that he had been duped in still another particular. "We've done uncommonly well," Parks remarked when the photograph had been taken, "but we're not by any means out of the woods yet. In fact, the real work is only beginning. We don't even yet know the size of the problem we're up against. We've got to find that out, and then we've got to make a plan and put it through, and all the time we've got to lie low in case that infernal ass has reported us to the police." "We've got to get these photographs taken, and then we've got to get our supper," retorted Price. "For goodness sake, let's have one thing at a time, Blessington. If you'd lend a hand instead of standing there preaching, it would be more to the point." Here was another alias. Parks' real name was Blessington. Cheyne's was beginning to wonder what Price and Susan were really called, when the next remark satisfied his curiosity. Parks, or Blessington, took Price's remark easily. "Now that's where you make the mistake, Mr. James Dangle," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "Miss Dangle and I do the real work in this joint, don't we, Miss Dangle? We supply the brains, you and Syme only rise to the muscles. Eh, Miss Dangle?" But Miss Dangle was not in a mood for pleasantries. "We shall want all the brains that you can supply and more," she answered irritably, and then, turning lazily to the others, demanded if they weren't ever going to be done messing with the darned camera. At last Cheyne thought he had got the four fixed in his mind. The man on the rug, the man who had drugged him in the Plymouth Hotel, was Blessington. The man who had introduced himself as Lamson and afterward said his name was Price bore neither of these appellations. His name was Dangle. Susan was Miss Dangle, and almost certainly sister to James. Lewisham, the motorman of the Enid, was Syme. Dangle, Syme, and Blessington. Why, there was something sinister in the very names. And as Cheyne peeped guardedly in beneath the blind, he felt there was something even more sinister in their owners. Dangle, with his hard-bitten features and without his veneer of polish, looked a crafty scoundrel. There was a nasty gleam in his foxy eyes. He looked a man who would sell his best friend for a shilling. Perhaps Cheyne's imagination had by this time run away with him, but Syme now struck him as a murderous-looking ruffian, and Blessington's smug features seemed but to cloak an evil and cruel nature. He was smiling, but there was nothing mirthful about his smile. Rather, it was the expression that a wolf might be supposed to wear when he sees a sheep helpless before his attack. Cheyne did not know if Susan was dangerous, but he had always suspected she could be vindictive and bad-tempered. A nice crew, he thought, and he shivered in spite of himself as he pictured his fate were some accident to lead to his discovery. And what inventive genius they had shown! They had now told him 3 yarns, all convincing, well-thought-out statements, and all entirely false. There was first of all Blessington's dissertation of his, Cheyne's literary efforts, told to get him off his guard so that a drug might be administered to him and his pockets be searched. Then there was the account of the position indicator for ships, detailed and plausible, a bait to lure him voluntarily aboard the Enid. Lastly, there was the story of the Hull succession, including the interesting episode of the attempted rescue of the Uncle St. John Price, undoubtedly related with the object of reducing Cheyne's scruples in handing over the letter. These people were certainly past masters in the art of decorative lying, and once again he marveled at the trouble which had been taken in making each story watertight so as to assure its success. It was for no small reward that this had been done. Cheyne was getting stiff with cold on the ladder. Though keenly interested in what he saw, he wished his enemies would make some move so that he might advance or, if necessary, retreat. But they appeared in no special hurry, proceeding with the photographs in the most careful and deliberate way. A desultory conversation was kept up, only part of which he heard, but nothing further was said which threw any light on the identity of the conspirators or on the objects for which they were assembled. The work with the camera progressed, however, and presently 3 photographs had been taken. "Once more," he heard Dangle remark, and having pulled out the shutter, the whilom skipper of the Enid pressed the bulb and another photograph was taken. "That's 4 altogether," Dangle went on in satisfied tones. "I guess we're well provided for against accidents. What about that bit of supper, old lady?" "Aren't we waiting for you?" Susan demanded as she slowly pulled herself up out of the chair. "Gosh," she went on, lazily stretching herself and yawning, "but it's good to be done with Devonshire. I was fed up, I can tell you. Susan this and Susan that. Susan, we'll have tea now. Susan, you might bring a tray and take up the mistress's breakfast. Susan, you might light the fire in the study. Mr. Cheyne wants to work. Yeah, I guess I've about done my share." The men exchanged glances, but only Dangle spoke. "I guess you have, old girl," he conceded. "But finish out this job and you'll live like a lady for the rest of your life." "It'll be a poor lookout for you if I don't," she grumbled, and Syme having opened the door, she passed out, followed by the others. Cheyne, watching breathlessly, saw a light spring up in a ground-floor window, fortunately not below him but at the far end of the house. His heart beat quickly. Was it possible that his great chance had come already, and that the gang had delivered themselves into his hands? A little coolness, a little daring, a little nerve, and he believed he could carry off a coup that would entirely reverse the situation. The document on the wall must surely be that which the criminals had stolen from him. Could he not regain it while they were downstairs at their supper? He decided with fierce delight that he would try. It was an adventure after his own heart. Carefully, he grasped the lower sash and pressed gently upwards. To his delight, it moved. With infinite care, he pushed it higher and higher until at last he was able to work his way into the room. Evidently, he had not been heard, as the muffled sounds of conversation continued to rise unbrokenly from the supper room. He tiptoed lightly across the room and gazed in surprise at the document fixed to the wall. It was certainly not the copy of a birth or marriage certificate, nor anything connected with a claim to a barony. It was a sheet of tracing linen some 15 inches high by 12 inches wide, covered with little circles spaced irregularly and without any apparent plan, like the keys of a typewriter gone mad. Some of these circles contained numbers and others letters, also arranged without apparent plan. The only thing he could read about the whole document was a phrase, written in a circle from the center like the figures on a clock dial. "England expects every man to do his duty." Cheyne stared in amazement, but soon realizing that his time might be short, he silently removed the drawing pins, folded the tracing, and thrust it into his pocket. Then, turning to the camera, he withdrew the dark slide, opened first one and then the other of its shutters, closed them again, and replaced it in the camera. A few seconds sufficed to open and close the shutters of the other slide lying on the table. With a hurried glance round to make sure that no other paper was lying about which might also have formed part of the contents of Price's envelope, he tiptoed back to the window and prepared to make his escape. But as he laid his hand on the blind, he was halted by a sound from below. Someone had opened what was evidently the back door of the house, and had stepped out on the ground below the window. Then Syme's voice came grumbling and muffled. "Where the blazes do you keep the darn stuff? How can I find it in the dark?" There was a moment's pause. Then, in a changed voice, a sudden sharp call of, "Here, James! Look here quickly! What's this?" He had seen the ladder. Cheyne realized that his retreat was cut off. A sudden tumult arose downstairs. Hasty feet ran towards the garden, and voices spoke low and hurriedly beneath the window. Cheyne saw that his only hope lay in instant action. He silently hurried across the room, tore the door open, and ran to the head of the stairs. His hope was that he might slip down and out of the door while the others were still at the back of the house. But he was just too late. As he reached the stairs, he heard steps approaching the hall below. His retreat was cut off in this direction also. There remained only one thing to do, and he did it almost without thought. Opening the next door to that of the sitting room, he stepped noiselessly inside, closing the door save for a narrow chink through which he could hear and see what was happening. Two of the men had raced up to the sitting room, and peeping out, Cheyne saw that they were Blessington and Syme. In a moment they were out again and running down shouting, "It's gone, James. The tracing's gone." Sounds indicative of surprise and consternation arose from below, but Cheyne could no longer hear the words. Then, through the window, which also looked out over the garden, he heard Dangle's voice. "Keep guard of the house, Susan and Blessington. Come with me, Syme," and the sound of 2 pairs of feet rushing away towards the lane. Instinctively, Cheyne realized that his chance had come. It was now or never. If he could not escape while 2 of the conspirators were away, he would have no chance when all 4 were present. He came out of his hiding place and peeped through the well down into the hall. The electric light had been turned on, and the hall was brilliantly illuminated. In it stood Blessington, glancing alternately up the stairs and out through a door to the back. In his hand he held an automatic pistol, and from the look of fury and desperation on his face, Cheyne had no doubt that he would not hesitate to use it if he saw him. "They must have only just gone," Blessington cried through the door with a lurid oath, and Susan's voice answered with another equally vivid string of blasphemy. Cheyne stood tense, scarcely daring to breathe and on the qui-vive to take advantage of any chance that might offer. But Blessington wasn't going to give chances. He stood there with his pistol raised, and unarmed as Cheyne was, he recognized the hopelessness of trying to rush him. He thought there might be a chance of escape from some of the other rooms, and silently crept about in the hope of finding a window or skylight from which he might perhaps obtain access to a downspout. But so far as he could ascertain in the dark, there was nothing of the kind, and after a few minutes had passed, he retraced his steps and set himself to watch Blessington. He wondered whether he could make some noise with the ladder which would attract the 2 watchers to the garden, and thus enable him to make a bolt for the front door. But while he was considering this, he heard other voices which revealed the fact that Dangle and Syme had returned. Then Dangle's voice sounded in the hall. "'Fraid they've got away, but we'd better search the house again to make sure. You stick at the stairs, Susan, while we do the lower rooms." Steps sounded below as the men moved from room to room. Cheyne's heart was pounding as it had done on different occasions before his ship had gone into action during the war, but he was calm and collected and determined to take the least chance that offered. Presently, he heard the men joining Susan in the hall. Now was the only chance he was likely to get, and at all costs he must make the most of it. He hurried back to the sitting-room window, and setting his teeth, lifted the blind and silently crawled out. So far, he had not been seen, and as rapidly as he dared, he climbed down the ladder. Another 5 seconds and he would have got clear away, but at that moment the alarm was given. One of the men, looking out of the window, saw him in the now fairly clear light of the moon. Hurried steps sounded, and Blessington appeared at the open door. Fearful of his pistol, Cheyne leaped for his life. He landed on his feet, staggered, recovered himself, and darted like a hare across the flower beds. With any ordinary luck, he should have got clear away, but Blessington had picked up a broom as he ran, and this he threw with fatal aim. It caught Cheyne between the legs, and he fell headlong. Other steps came hurrying up. By the light streaming from the back door, he saw an arm raised. It fell, and something crashed with a sickening thud on his head. He saw a vivid shower of sparks. There was a roaring in his ears. Great dark waves seemed to rise up and encompass him, and he remembered no more. End of chapter 6.